Hello, very good morning. Our today's topic is functions of BIOS. The BIOS functions, post and bootstrap loading we are going to discuss. Post is power and self-test and bootstrap loading. These are the two things we are going to discuss in this class. In the last class, we have seen what is meant by hardware and what is meant by software, types of software, and BIOS. What is BIOS? So in this class we are going to see the functions of BIOS functions, post and bootstrap loading. So before going to see post and bootstrap loading, we will see a little bit about BIOS functions and what is meant by BIOS. So BIOS stands for Basic Input Output System. BIOS is a small program which is pre-installed on computer system. BIOS is used to start up the computers. So BIOS is the first program which is installed in Windows computers even before the operating system. So BIOS stands for Basic Input Output System. It is sequence of steps occur when we switch on the computer. So BIOS is nothing but it is a program which is stored on ROM, read-only memory, on motherboard. So it contains instructions to start up the computer even before the operating system. So BIOS is the first ever program which is started immediately after we switch on the computer. A computer's basic input-output system and complementary metal oxide semiconductor together handle a rudimentary and essential process. When it takes place, when we switch on the computer, and after switch on the time between we switch on the computer and when we get the desktop. So in this time duration, some steps and some essential process is carried out in the computer, and this essential process is completed by BIOS. And here they set up the computer and boot the operating system. These are the essential process. So BIOS set up the computer first and boot the operating system. So here the BIOS primary function is to handle the system setup process including driver loading and operating system booting. So BIOS primary function is it handles the system startup and setup process including the drivers and also loading the operating system booting. So without operating system we cannot work with the system. That's why operating system must be loaded in the system. Generally operating system is located in the hard disk of any system. So here BIOS, when we switch on, it starts processing. The first program executed in the computer is BIOS. So there are series of instructions are stored in the form of BIOS on ROM. So these series of instructions are executed when we switch on the computer. So generally we switch on the computer means we switch on the SMPS, which is inside the computer, switched mode power supply. That SMPS supplies the power to the motherboard. In turn, the the BIOS is activated, the series of instructions which are stored in the form of BIOS are starts executing to set up the computer before operating system is loaded. So first we have to set up the computer with the help of BIOS. Then BIOS load the operating system into the main memory. That is nothing but called booting. So when we boot the system, then only we will get the command prompt or desktop. So when we get the desktop is nothing but the system is indicating that the system is ready for accepting the commands. So after switch on the computer and when we get the desktop, in between them there is a series of actions takes place in the computer. Those series of actions are carried out by the BIOS. So we will see what are the series of actions. Here the CMOS's primary function is to handle and store the BIOS configuration settings. So here this process goes. When we switch on a computer, the CPU accesses the BIOS to locate all input-output devices and check if all hardware connections are properly functional. So this is most important function inside the computer. It means when we are going to work with the system, generally we switch on the computer. After switch on the computer, there is a system that every device which is connected in the CPU, every device which are installed in the computer, all the devices will be checked first, ensuring that all the devices are working properly. Then only the computer starts working. If any of the devices gives error, if any of the devices is not working, then CPU gives the error message. So this is also carried out by the BIOS, carried out in the BIOS stage. So here it is a BIOS which loads the operating system in the computer memory, thus completing the process of booting. So when we switch on the computer, the first program started execution is BIOS. So BIOS, it will check all the devices first, hardware components, everything, whether they are working properly or not. After ensuring all the devices are working properly, then the BIOS starts loading the operating system into the computer memory. This is called booting. A computer user need not do any changes in BIOS as it is installed at the time of configuration of the computer. Generally, the instructions in the form of BIOS are stored in the ROM, and these are stored by the computer manufacturer. So there is no need to change anything in the BIOS except some settings we can do. Now the question arises, if BIOS load the operating system and measures all hardware including hard drives, then where does the BIOS reside? Okay, we know the operating system generally located in the hard disk drive or any other secondary storage device. So where the BIOS reside inside the computer? So the answer is that the BIOS input-output system is part of the motherboard. The BIOS is stored in the permanent memory, that is non-volatile read-only memory, that is called ROM, or erasable programmable read-only memory, that is called EEPROM chip, or it's also called flash memory on the motherboard of a computer. So we can conclude that the BIOS, basic input-output system instructions, it is a part of motherboard. Generally we can find a chip, a read-only memory chip on the motherboard. So in that ROM, the BIOS information is stored by the computer manufacturer. So what are the functions of BIOS? The BIOS is responsible for loading basic computer hardware and booting of the operating system. The BIOS contains various instructions for loading the hardware. The BIOS also conducts a test which aids in verifying if the computer meets all the basic requirements for booting. This test is called the power on self-test or simply POST. So when we switch on the computer, the first program starts executed is called BIOS. So BIOS contains series of instructions. It is responsible for checking all the hardware inside the computer, and it is also responsible for loading the operating system, finding the operating system where the operating system is located. Generally, operating system is located in the C drive of hard disk, or operating system may be located in CD-ROM drive or some other drive. So it is the responsibility of BIOS to check whether where operating system is located, finds the operating system and starts loading the operating system from secondary storage device to main memory is called booting. So this is a main function. So it checks all the hardware. After ensuring that all the hardware is working, then it starts loading the operating system into the main memory. So it also conducts a test, nothing but it checks each and every hardware which already we have uh, discussed. So this test is called power on self-test. So these are the functions of BIOS once we see. First one is the power on self-test. First function, the first and foremost function of BIOS is to make sure that the computer hardware is functioning properly and there is no issue with the hardware. So this is done by the power on self-test. If the post test fails, computer generates different types of beeps to indicate the type of error. If the post test is passed, then booting starts. So first and primary function of BIOS is it will check all the hardware, whether the hardware is functioning properly or not. And it ensures that there is no error issues with the hardware. So this is done by post, that is nothing but power on self-test. If post fails, nothing but if any of the computer device is not working, then this post indicates that error by means of in the form of beeps, nothing but giving some beep sounds, or indicate the type of error on the monitor itself. If the monitor itself is failed, the post gives some errors in the form of beeps, long beeps, short beeps, like that. So if the post test is passed, then booting starts. So what is the booting? After successful completion of post, in the first function, the BIOS locates and identifies the operating system. The BIOS then passes the control to the operating system. If it finds one, this is called booting. So after completion of post, the BIOS locates, it searches for operating system. If the operating system does not find, then it gives the error again. If it finds somewhere, it means generally the operating system is located in the C drive of hard disk. So it finds there and starts loading the operating system from hard disk to the main memory. This is called booting. So another function is BIOS setup, system configuration setup program. This is usually a menu driven program which enables to configure the motherboard and chipset settings along with the date and time, passwords, disk drives and other basic system settings. So this BIOS setup is a menu driven program which enables and which gives a chance to change a configuration to some extent about the motherboard, chipset settings. We can change the date and time, and also passwords, system passwords, disk drive types and everything, and other basic system settings we can do with the BIOS setup. If we don't want to change this setup, simply we can skip this setup process. So if you want to go to this setup process, immediately when you switch on the computer, then we have to press generally F2 or F10 or delete key. Then we enter into the BIOS setup. Otherwise, if you want to change the settings only, we have to enter into the BIOS setup. Otherwise, we can skip this step. And after that, BIOS drivers. The BIOS drivers are a collection of programs that are stored in non-volatile erasable memory chips. The BIOS drivers gives basic information about computer hardware. So driver is nothing but technical details of a particular device. So generally in computer there are different parts are available: motherboard, hard disk drive, floppy disk drive or CD-ROM drive, auxiliary graphics port, or maximum other any devices are available. Input and output devices are available, storage devices are available. So generally motherboard itself have some drivers. It's nothing but technical details about the device. So BIOS also BIOS also loads these technical details called drivers information about the computer hardware. So if we load the correct driver, nothing but correct technical information about a particular device, then computer normally works. Otherwise it gives some error. So these are the four functions of BIOS: post, power on self-test, booting, BIOS setup, and BIOS drivers. So these are the functions of the BIOS. So among these BIOS functions, we are going to see post, one of the function of the BIOS, and bootstrap loading, another function of the BIOS. So post is short for power on self-test. It is the initial set of diagnostic steps performed by the computer right after it's powered on, with the intent to check for any hardware related issues. So most important factor in the computer. When the system powered on, immediately a process starts. That process is called power on self-test process, which is one of the main function of BIOS. So it is initiated automatically according to the instruction of BIOS. Post is initiated. So it contains diagnostic tests for all the hardware devices inside the computer, and it checks each and every device, ensures that the devices are working properly. Computers are not the only devices that run a post. Some appliances, medical equipment, and other devices also run very similar self-test after being powered on. A power on self-test is a process performed by firmware or software routines immediately after a computer or other digital electronic device is powered on. So it is software routines performed immediately after a computer or other digital electronic device is powered on. So it is pre-programmed system. When we switch on the computer, the post starts functioning. If the post test fails, computer generates different types of beeps to indicate the type of error. If the post test is passed, then booting starts. So if any error is there in terms of hardware, the process there itself indicates the type of error. Generally, it gives the error in the form of beep codes, or sometimes it will display error code on the monitor itself. The post test is passed. If there is no any errors, if there are no errors while post, then the booting starts. So the duties of the main BIOS during post, or what are the duties, what are the functions, what are the main duties of the BIOS are: verify the CPU registers, the BIOS in the post, verify the integrity of the BIOS code itself, verify some basic components like DMA, direct memory access, timers and interrupt controllers, find size and verify system main memory, initialize the BIOS, pass control to other specialized extension BIOSes if installed, identify, organize and select which devices are available for booting. So these are the main duties of the post BIOS during the post. So it verify all the devices, especially CPU registers, and verify the components like the DMA, timer, interrupt controller. It also find the size and verify the system main memory, and pass control to other specialized extension BIOSes, identify, organize and select which devices are available for booting. So all the devices will be checked for different reasons or for different areas, and ensures that all the devices are working properly, then only it starts booting. So these are the main duties of BIOS during post. The role of post in startup process. So what is the role? A power and self test is the first step of the boot sequence. If it does not matter, it does not matter if just restarted the computer or if just powered it on for the first time in days, the post is going to run regardless. It does not matter if the computer is first started or it is started number of times and shut down. So anyway, when we switch on the computer, simply post starts working. If post passes only, then booting takes place. Post does not rely on any specific operating system, because that post is the very first code to start under the control of the BIOS. So here there is no need of operating system. Any operating system can be installed on the computer, but BIOS starts functioning on its own way, because BIOS installed by the computer manufacturer, whereas operating system is defined and designed by some other manufacturer, or some other operating system is designed by some other manufacturer. So the first basic thing starts is BIOS post. In fact, there does not even need to be an OS installed on a hard drive for the post to run. There is no need of operating system here. Before operating system only the post takes place. After post success only, post passes only, the operating system is loaded. So at the post stage, there is no need of operating system, and it won't rely on the operating system. BIOS starts working. So now the function of the BIOS is post, it starts functioning. Test each and every device in the computer. If if any device is not working, it gives the error message. Otherwise, it starts booting. So this is because the test is handled by the system's BIOS, not any installed software. So post do not need any operating system or any other software to start. The role of the post in startup process again. The power on self-test checks the basic system devices are present and working properly, like keyboard and other peripheral devices and other hardware elements like the processor, storage devices and the memory. So it checks all the devices whether they are working properly or not. The computer will continue to boot after the post, but only if it was successful. The computer starts booting when the post passes, post successful only. The post fails I mean, if any error occurs during the post, so we cannot load operating system, nothing but we cannot boot. So we have to rectify those errors. Problem can certainly appear after the post, like Windows hanging during startup, but most of the time those can be attributed to an operating system or software problem, not a hardware one. If any hardware problem comes, that will be indicated, that will be informed at the post stage only. So it won't go to the next step, that is nothing but booting. So if it gives any severe error message, it won't go to booting. So it stops in the post stage only. If the post finds something wrong during its test, we will usually get an error of some kind and hopefully want to clear enough to help jump start the troubleshooting process. So problems during the post. Remember that the power on self-test is just a self-test. Just about anything that might prevent the computer from continuing to start will prompt some kind of error. Errors might come in the form of flashing LEDs, audible beeps, or error messages on the monitor, all of which are technically referred to as post codes, beep codes, and on-screen post error messages respectively. So here, during the power on self-test, while checking all the hardware, if any error comes, any error occurs, any hardware error occurs, then the post inform in the form of flashing LEDs, audible beeps, or error messages on the monitor. So flashing LED is nothing but post codes here, and audible beeps are called beep codes, and on-screen error messages, post error messages. So by seeing the on-screen post error messages, or after hearing any beep codes, we can assume that the computer is having some error in the form of hardware. So beep codes are some series of beep codes will be given. We have to check the manual of the BIOS. We came to know that what are the beep codes and everything. The standard beep codes are also there. By seeing the beep codes, by listening the beep codes, we can conclude that the system is having some problem. So if any error message it displays, by seeing the error code also we can know what is the type of error occurred inside the computer. So if some part of the post fails, it will be known very soon after powering on computer, but how we find out depends on the type and severity of the problem. Example, if the problem lies with the video card and therefore we cannot see anything on monitor, then looking for an error message would not be as helpful as listening for a beep code or reading a post code with post test card. So generally, if any error occurs during post, a corresponding error message will be displayed on the video. But if video card itself got the problem and it is not working, where it displays the error messages, it won't give any error message in the monitor because the corresponding video card is failed. So then the BIOS post indicates the error message by giving some beep codes. So based on the beep codes, we know that the error is video card. Suppose both Macintosh and Windows PCs run a post each time the computer is booted up or restarted. The scan checks the hardware and makes sure the processor, RAM, and storage devices are all functioning correctly. If an error is encountered during the post, the startup process may pause or halt completely and the error may be displayed on the monitor. On PCs, post errors are often displayed on the BIOS information screen. They may be output as cryptic code such as 08 for bad memory, or as a system message such as system RAM failed at offset. On Macs, post errors are often indicated by a simple graphic such as broken folder icon that indicates no bootable device was found. So errors about the power and self-test. Almost everything might prevent the computer from continuing to boot will signal some kind of error. Errors can come in the form of flashing LEDs, audible beeps or error messages on the display, all of which are technically called post codes, beep codes and on-screen power and self-test error messages. So some of the typical post beeps and their corresponding meanings here we can see. So if you get a short beep, that is normal post, the system is okay. Two short beeps, post error code is shown on the screen. No beep, power supply, system mode problem, disconnected CPU or disconnected speaker. These are the possible problems if no beep sound comes. Continuous beep, power supply, system board, or maybe RAM problem or keyboard problem. If any of the problem persists in this area, it gives a beep continuously. Repeating short beeps means power supply or system board or keyboard problem. One long beep and one short beep, it is called system board, it indicating that it is a system board problem. One long and two short beeps, display adapter problem, nothing but MDA or CGA or VGA. So one long and three short beeps, enhanced graphics adapter problem, and three long beeps with 3270 keyboard card problem. So these are some of the typical error messages in the form of beep codes displayed by the post. So post is part of device pre-boot sequence. When post is successfully finalized, bootstrapping is enabled. Bootstrapping starts the initialization of the operating system. Examples of a bootstrapping program are the Linux loader, Windows NT loader, and Linux's Grant Unified bootloader. So this is about the post. So when the post is successfully completed, it starts initialization of the bootstrapping is enabled. So bootstrapping starts the initialization of the operating system. So next step after the post is bootstrap loader. So what is the bootstrap loader? Bootstrap loading. Bootstrap loader, also called bootloader, boot program, initial program loader, or bootstrapping, is a program that resides in computer's EEPROM, ROM, or another non-volatile memory. So bootstrap loading is automatically executed by the processor when turning on the computer after post. The bootstrap loader reads the hard drive's boot sector to continue to load the computer's operating system. The term bootstrap comes from the old phrase, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So this is the basic where the word bootstrap comes from. The old phrase, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. When the computer is turned on or restarted, the bootstrap loader first performs a power and self-test, also known as post. If the post is successful and no issues are found, the bootstrap loader loads the operating system for the computer into memory. The computer can then access, load, and run the operating system. The bootstrap loader was replaced in computers that have an EFI, extensible firmware interface, and is now part of the EFI BIOS. So bootstrap loaded. After post only it starts executing, nothing but it initializes the starting of the operating system, loading of the operating system from secondary memory to main memory. A bootstrap loader primarily manages and executes the boot sequence of a computer system. A Bootstrap loader program is typically started after the computer or the BIOS have finished performing the initial power and hardware device checks and tests. The Bootstrap loading fetches the operating system kernel from the hard disk or any specified boot device with the boot sequence into the main memory. A Bootstrap loader is associated with only a single operating system. An operating system can also have multiple Bootstrap loader programs classified as primary and secondary Bootstrap loaders, where a secondary Bootstrap loader might be larger and more capable than the primary Bootstrap loader. So this is the system boot up process. BIOS starts and performs post, then bootloader and starts loading kernel of the operating system, then operating system login. This is the system boot process. So steps in the booting process. Booting is a process of switching on the computer and starting the operating system. See, in between the switching on the computer and starting the operating system, there are number of steps takes place. There are 6 steps of the booting process here. BIOS and setup program, the power and self-test, the operating system loads, system configuration, system utility loads, and user authentication. So these are the 6 steps in booting process. Here we can see BIOS is loaded. It conducts the power on self-test. It is also completed. Then operating system is loaded. The next step is system configuration is accomplished and system utilities are loaded. Then user is authenticated. Then user can start working with the system. So these are the steps in booting process of Bootstrap loader. So far we have seen what is meant by post and Bootstrap loader. These are the functions of BIOS. So in the next video, in continuation of this video, we will also view an animated video on this booting process and BIOS and self-test. Thank you. So far we have seen BIOS functions, post and Bootstrap loading. So now we are going to watch an animated video how the system boot up process takes place. Nothing but BIOS functions and post and everything. So here, so booting process is nothing but when we switch on the computer, the booting process starts. It's nothing but here we are switch on the computer. So when we switch on the computer here, the power starts giving this SMPS gives the power to the motherboard. So here this is called SMPS, switch and mode power supply, and this will give the power to the motherboard. So in turn the BIOS will be activated. So BIOS is the first program to be executed. So the BIOS is stored here. This BIOS is nothing but basic input and output system, and it performs power and self-test, the first instruction in the BIOS, and this BIOS is stored in the form of ROM. The instructions are stored in the ROM, that is nothing but read-only memory. It is a read-only memory chip as a part of the basic input output system. Generally, this is available on the motherboard. So this is the BIOS, basic input output system. It is in the form of ROM stored in the read-only memory on the motherboard. So first BIOS, the first function of the BIOS is power on self-test. So power on self-test, it tests all the devices. If any error found while testing all the devices in power on self-test process, it indicates. So first it will check the VGA card here. If the VGA cards work properly, then it goes to the another device to check. So next it goes to the CPU. Here it checks the CPU, and after that the Post checks the RAM, random access memory. If any errors occur, if any error occur during the RAM checking, it will give the long beeps. So we can conclude that the RAM is not working properly. Then it will goes to the keyboard and mouse, all the input and output input devices. So it checks the all the keyboard and functioning properly or not. So here, after checking all the devices, if we want to change any settings, we can go to the BIOS settings. So these BIOS settings, in these BIOS settings, we can check the CPU, RAM, video, keyboard and mouse. So to enter into the BIOS setup, generally we have to press F2 or F10 or a delete key. Maximum now maximum for any BIOS we have to press F2 button to enter into the BIOS setup. So after entering into the BIOS setup, it gives us some menus, menu driven programs are available. So in that we can change the settings of the different hardware devices inside the computers. So these settings generally we can set date and time, and also checking the boot order. So in what is the boot order means? If any computer, when we switch on, BIOS starts working. The first function of the BIOS is post. Post is nothing but power on selected. It checks in the post process all the devices are checked, hardware is checked. If any error comes, it will give indicates. If the post completes successfully, then it starts booting. So in the process of booting, the BIOS checks for locating operating system where it is located. Generally, operating system is located in hard disk drive, but there is a boot order. There is a boot order. Here we can say checking boot order. So generally, the boot order like this, checking the optical media for booting instructions, and then it goes for hard disk drive. In olden days, it was first it will checks the floppy disk drive, then it goes to the hard disk drive. So we can here in this latest BIOS settings, we can change this boot order also. Nothing but generally we set the first booting order device is optical media. Then after we will check, we will give second booting order area for a hard disk drive. So this BIOS first checks for operating system in optical media. If does not find the operating system in the optical media, then it goes for hard disk drive. If the operating system is found in the hard disk drive, then it starts loading the operating system from hard disk to main memory. So while loading, it first checks for master boot record in the hard disk drive. So for operating system, it checks the master boot record in the hard disk drive. So the MBR, the master boot record, is always located at cylinder 0, head 0 and sector 1 or 0001. So it points to the boot sector. Once the MBR is found, the control is passed to the post to the operating system referenced in the MBR. Then it starts operating system loaded from that particular hard disk to the main memory. After loading the operating system here, then operating system takes over the control of the system here. So this is about the boot process in the computer system. Thank you.